She was worth exactly 1 horse. That was the price her stepfather placed on 19 years of her life, 19 years of servitude disguised as family duty. Sold to settle a gambling debt to a duke she'd never met, Abigail Turner believed she was simply trading one form of misery for another. But when the carriage doors opened at Ravenshollow Castle, she had no idea she was about to meet a man as broken as herself, a duke who had locked his heart away after tragedy stole everything he loved. What began as a transaction between strangers would become the most unexpected love story of the century, proving that sometimes the most beautiful roses bloom in the darkest soil, and that two wounded souls can heal each other in ways neither ever dared to dream. The morning Abigail Turner learned her worth in pounds and shillings, she was scrubbing the kitchen floor of the cramped cottage that had never truly been her home. Her knees ached against the cold stone, her hands were raw from the harsh soap, and her back protested every movement as she worked to remove the stains left by her stepfather's latest drinking companions. "Abigail!" The harsh voice of Martha Turner cut through the quiet morning air like a blade. "Get yourself in here this instant." Abigail winced, recognizing the particular tone that meant trouble. She had heard it countless times over the past 14 years, ever since her mother had died and left her at the mercy of a woman who had never wanted a stepdaughter and a man who saw her as nothing more than unpaid labor. Setting down her scrub brush with hands that trembled slightly, Abigail rose to her feet and smoothed her worn grey dress. The fabric had been mended so many times that the original color was barely discernible, and the sleeves were too short for her tall frame, but it was the best of her 3 dresses, and she had learned long ago that appearing before her step-parents in anything less than her best only invited more criticism. She found Martha and Harold Turner in the small parlor, their faces wearing expressions that made her stomach clench with dread. Harold sat slumped in his favorite chair, his clothes wrinkled and reeking of gin, while Martha stood beside him with her arms crossed and her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "Sit down, girl," Harold commanded, without looking at her, his voice slurred, despite the early hour. Abigail perched carefully on the edge of a wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her green eyes fixed on the floor. Years of experience had taught her that making eye contact during these conversations only made things worse. "Your stepfather has gotten himself into a bit of trouble," Martha began, her voice carrying the particular brand of false sweetness that always preceded bad news. "Gambling debts, you understand, quite substantial ones." Abigail's heart sank, though she wasn't entirely surprised. Harold's drinking and gambling had been getting progressively worse over the past year, and she had noticed the worried whispers between him and Martha, the way creditors had begun appearing at their door with increasing frequency. "How much?" she asked quietly, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. £500, Harold mumbled, finally lifting his bloodshot eyes to meet hers. "Lost it all in a single night to the Duke of Ravenshollow. Cards, horses, dice, everything went against me. £500. The sum was so enormous that Abigail could barely comprehend it. It was more money than their household saw in several years, more than most working families could earn in a lifetime. "But don't you worry," Martha said with that same false brightness. "We've found a solution. The Duke has agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for, well, in exchange for you." The words hit Abigail like a physical blow. For a moment she was certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon. You're to marry him," Harold said bluntly, apparently having decided that subtlety was pointless. "The Duke of Ravenshollow. Ceremonies to be next week." Abigail stared at them both, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. You're selling me?" "Don't be dramatic," Martha snapped. "We're arranging a marriage. A very advantageous one, I might add. You'll be a duchess, which is far more than a girl in your position has any right to expect." "But I don't know him," Abigail protested, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never even met him, and he doesn't know me. Why would he agree to such a thing?" Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Apparently the man's in need of a wife, something about heirs and duties and such. The details don't matter. What matters is that this solves both our problems." "Your problems," Abigail corrected, a rare flash of anger breaking through her usual careful composure. "This solves your problems. What about mine?" "Your problems?" Martha's voice rose to a near shriek. "Girl, you've been nothing but a burden to us for 14 years. We've fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head, and this is the thanks we get. Ingratitude and selfishness." The accusation was so unfair that Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. She had worked like a servant in this house since she was 5 years old. cooking, cleaning, mending, and tending to every need of her stepfamily. She had never asked for anything beyond the basic necessities of survival, had never complained about the endless chores or the harsh words or the way she was treated more like hired help than family. "I've earned my keep," she said quietly. "I've worked for everything I've received." "Have you indeed?" Harold's voice was dangerous now, the voice he used when he was building toward one of his rages. "And where exactly would you go if we turned you out tomorrow? What skills do you have beyond scrubbing floors and mending clothes? What prospects? What future?" The questions hit their mark because Abigail knew he was right. She had no money, no connections, no family beyond the Turners. At 19, she was already considered a spinster by most standards, and her lack of dowry or social standing made her virtually unmarriageable within her own class. "At least this way, you'll have a title," Martha added, apparently deciding to try a more conciliatory approach. "You'll be a duchess, Abigail. Think of it. Fine clothes, servants, a grand house. It's more than you ever could have hoped for." "And if he's cruel?" Abigail asked, voicing the fear that was growing larger with each passing moment. "If he's unkind or worse, then you'll endure it, as women have always done," Martha replied with brutal honesty. "At least you'll endure it in comfort rather than poverty." The conversation continued for another hour, but Abigail knew that her fate was already sealed. She had no choice in the matter, no power to refuse or negotiate. She was being traded like a piece of property to settle a debt, and her feelings on the matter were irrelevant. That evening, as she sat in her small attic room packing her few belongings into a battered trunk, Abigail tried to imagine what her future husband might be like. The Duke of Ravenshollow. She had heard the name before, whispered in the village, with a mixture of respect and unease. He was said to be wealthy beyond imagination, the owner of vast estates and countless properties. But he was also said to be strange, reclusive, a man who had withdrawn from society after some terrible tragedy. What kind of man agreed to marry a complete stranger to settle a gambling debt? What kind of man was so desperate for a wife that he would accept one sight unseen, with no dowry or connections to recommend her? The questions plagued her as she tried to sleep. And when morning came, she felt no more prepared for her fate than she had the night before. The Duke's carriage would arrive at noon to collect her, and by evening she would be at Ravenshollow Castle, preparing for a wedding to a man she had never met. As she dressed in her best dress, a simple blue muslin that had belonged to her mother, Abigail caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her wash basin. She saw a young woman with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, green eyes that were too large for her face, and skin that was pale from too many hours spent indoors working. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something arresting about her features, a quiet strength that showed in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. Would the Duke find her acceptable? Would he be disappointed when he saw what his £500 had bought him? The thought made her stomach churn with anxiety. At precisely noon, the sound of horses and wheels announced the arrival of the ducal carriage. Abigail watched from her window as the most magnificent vehicle she had ever seen rolled up to their humble cottage. It was black and gold, with the ducal crest emblazoned on the doors, and it was pulled by 4 perfectly matched horses that probably cost more than the Turners' entire cottage. 2 footmen in elaborate livery descended from the carriage, followed by a stern-looking woman in a dark travelling dress who could only be the Duke's housekeeper or chaperone. "Miss Turner?" the woman inquired when Martha opened the door. "I am Mrs. Hartwell, housekeeper at Ravenshollow Castle. I've come to escort you to His Grace." The formality of it all made Abigail feel even more like a piece of cargo being transported from one owner to another. She said her goodbyes to the Turners, such as they were, and allowed herself to be handed into the carriage by one of the footmen. As they pulled away from the cottage, Abigail pressed her face to the window and watched the only home she had ever known disappear behind them. She was leaving everything familiar, everything known, for a future that was completely uncertain. "His Grace is eager to meet you," Mrs. Hartwell said, apparently feeling some conversation was required. "The wedding is planned for tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow?" Abigail's voice came out as a squeak. "But I was told it would be next week." "His Grace prefers not to delay once he has made a decision," Mrs. Hartwell replied diplomatically. "I'm sure you'll find everything has been arranged to your satisfaction." Abigail doubted that very much, but she simply nodded and turned her attention back to the window. The countryside was beautiful, she had to admit. Rolling green hills dotted with sheep, ancient oak trees, and stone walls that had stood for centuries. As they travelled further from her old life, the landscape became more dramatic, with towering cliffs and wild moors that spoke of a wilder, more untamed part of England. It was nearly evening when Ravenshollow Castle finally came into view, and Abigail's breath caught in her throat at the sight of it. The castle was enormous, a sprawling structure of dark stone that seemed to grow out of the cliffs themselves. Towers and battlements rose against the darkening sky, and lights flickered in countless windows like stars in the darkness. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and as their carriage rolled through the massive gates and up the winding drive, Abigail felt as if she were entering another world entirely. "Welcome to Ravenshollow Castle," Mrs. Hartwell said, as they drew to a halt before the main entrance. "Your new home." As Abigail stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the imposing facade of the castle, she couldn't help but think that it looked more like a fortress than a home. But then, perhaps that was appropriate. After all, she was not arriving as a welcomed bride, but as payment for a debt. Tomorrow she would marry the Duke of Ravenshollow, a man she had never met, and begin a new life in this castle of shadows and secrets. She could only pray that whatever lay ahead would be better than what she was leaving behind. But as she followed Mrs. Hartwell through the massive doors and into the echoing halls of Ravenshollow Castle, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap from which there would be no escape. The Duke of Shadows. Jonathan Whitaker, the 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, stood at the window of his study, watching the approaching carriage with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. In a few moments, he would meet the young woman who was to become his Duchess, not out of love or even affection, but as payment for a gambling debt he had never expected to collect. The irony was not lost on him. 3 years ago, he would have laughed at the very idea of accepting a bride in lieu of money owed. But 3 years ago, he had been a different man entirely, a man who believed in love, in happiness, in the possibility of a future filled with joy and laughter. That man had died along with his beloved wife Catherine and their infant son in the fire that had consumed the east wing of the castle. What remained was a hollow shell, a duke who fulfilled his duties mechanically while feeling nothing, wanting nothing, hoping for nothing. At 32, Jonathan was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in England, despite his reputation for reclusiveness. His wealth was legendary, his bloodline impeccable, and his looks, when he bothered to appear in society, drew admiring glances from every unmarried woman in the room. But he had shown no interest in remarrying, had rebuffed every attempt at matchmaking, had made it clear that his heart was buried with his wife and child. So why had he agreed to this arrangement with Harold Turner? The answer was simple, though he was reluctant to admit it even to himself: loneliness. The castle that had once rung with Catherine's laughter and their son's babbling had become a mausoleum, a place where he wandered like a ghost through rooms that held too many memories. His servants were efficient, but distant. His few remaining friends had long since given up trying to draw him back into society, and his days blended together in an endless cycle of duty and emptiness. When Turner had come to him, desperate and pleading, offering his stepdaughter in marriage to settle his debt, Jonathan's first instinct had been to refuse. But something in the man's description of the girl had caught his attention, not her beauty or accomplishments, but her circumstances. Like him, she was alone in the world, unwanted and unloved by those who should have cared for her. Perhaps it was fitting that two broken souls should find themselves bound together by circumstance rather than choice. The carriage had stopped now, and Jonathan could see a slight figure emerging from within. Even from this distance, he could tell that Miss Turner was nervous. Her movements were careful and hesitant, and she seemed to shrink into herself as she looked up at the imposing facade of the castle. He should go down to greet her, he knew. It was the proper thing to do, the courteous thing. But Jonathan found himself reluctant to move from his position at the window. Once he met her, spoke to her, looked into her eyes, this arrangement would become real in a way it hadn't been before. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, not turning from the window. "Your Grace," came the voice of his butler, Stevens. "Miss Turner has arrived. Mrs. Hartwell is settling her in the blue room as you requested." "Thank you, Stevens. Please inform Mrs. Hartwell that I will meet with Miss Turner in the library in an hour." "Very good, Your Grace." An hour would give the girl time to refresh herself after her journey, and it would give him time to prepare for this meeting. What did one say to a woman one was about to marry for the sake of convenience? How did one begin a conversation that would determine the shape of both their futures? When the appointed time came, Jonathan made his way to the library, a vast room lined with books from floor to ceiling and dominated by a massive fireplace. He had always found the room soothing, but tonight it felt oppressive, the weight of all those words and stories pressing down on him like a physical presence. He was standing with his back to the door when he heard the soft sound of footsteps on the carpet. Turning, he got his first clear look at the woman who was to be his wife. Miss Abigail Turner was not what he had expected. Turner had described her as plain and unremarkable, a girl who would be grateful for any opportunity to better her circumstances. But the young woman standing before him was far from plain. She was tall and slender, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and the most extraordinary green eyes he had ever seen. There was something arresting about her face. Not conventional beauty, perhaps, but a quality that drew the eye and held it. More striking than her appearance, however, was her bearing. Despite her obvious nervousness, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. Her dress was simple and clearly well worn, but she wore it with a grace that many ladies of fashion would have envied. "Miss Turner," he said, inclining his head slightly, "welcome to Ravenshollow Castle." "Your Grace," she replied, offering a perfect curtsy. Her voice was soft but clear, with a slight musical quality that was pleasing to the ear. They stood looking at each other for a moment, each taking the measure of the other. Jonathan found himself wondering what she saw when she looked at him. Did she see the Duke, the title, the wealth? Or did she see the broken man beneath, the one who had been hollow and empty for 3 long years? "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. "I thought we should speak before tomorrow's ceremony." Abigail sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap, her green eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. "I want you to understand," Jonathan began, choosing his words carefully, "that this arrangement is one of convenience for both of us. I have need of a wife to fulfill certain social obligations, and you have need of security and position. I do not expect, that is, I do not anticipate that this will be a conventional marriage in all respects." A faint blush colored Abigail's cheeks, but her voice was steady when she replied, "I understand, Your Grace. I ask only that you treat me with basic kindness and respect. I have no illusions about the nature of this arrangement." Her directness surprised him. He had expected tears, perhaps, or protestations of romantic feeling, or at least some attempt to charm him into affection. Instead, she was being as practical about this as he was. "You will have your own apartments, of course," he continued. "The Duchess's suite has been prepared for you. You will have complete authority over the household staff and the running of the domestic arrangements. As my wife, you will be expected to act as hostess when I entertain, though I should warn you that I do very little entertaining these days." "I see." Abigail was quiet for a moment, then asked, "May I ask about your previous wife? I know it's perhaps not my place to inquire, but if I'm to live in her home, I feel I should understand." Jonathan felt the familiar stab of pain at the mention of Catherine, but it was duller now than it had been even a year ago. "My wife Catherine died 3 years ago, along with our infant son. There was a fire in the east wing of the castle. They were trapped." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak the words that would make it real again. But Abigail seemed to understand. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been devastating for you." The simple sympathy in her voice, free of the awkward platitudes he usually received, was unexpectedly moving. "It was," he said simply. "I loved them very much." "And you're not ready to love again," Abigail said, and it wasn't a question. Jonathan looked at her sharply, surprised by her perceptiveness. "No," he said, "I'm not. I may never be. If that troubles you—" "It doesn't," Abigail interrupted gently. "I don't expect love from this marriage, Your Grace. I've lived 19 years without it, and I've learned not to hope for what I cannot have." The sadness in her voice when she said those words made something twist in Jonathan's chest. What kind of life had she lived, that she had never known love? What had been done to this young woman to make her accept lovelessness as her natural state? "Tell me about yourself," he said, settling back in his chair. "Your family, your interests, your hopes for the future." Abigail was quiet for a long moment, as if she wasn't sure how to answer. "There isn't much to tell, I'm afraid. My mother died when I was 5. And I've lived with my stepfather and stepmother since then. I've managed their household, tended their garden, done whatever was needed. As for interests," she paused, then seemed to make a decision. "I love to read, when I can find the time. and I enjoy working with plants. There's something peaceful about helping things grow. What do you read? Whatever I can find. Poetry, novels, histories, treatises on agriculture and botany. The local vicar sometimes lends me books from his library. Jonathan found himself genuinely interested despite himself. An educated woman was rare enough in his circle, but one who had educated herself was almost unheard of. "And your hopes for the future?" he prompted. Abigail looked down at her hands. "I hope to be useful to you, Your Grace, to fulfill my duties as your wife, and to cause you no trouble or embarrassment. Beyond that," she shrugged slightly, "I've learned not to hope for too much." The resignation in her voice bothered him more than he cared to admit. She was 19 years old, and she spoke as if her life was already over, as if all possibilities for happiness had been exhausted. "You'll find life here quite different from what you're accustomed to," he said. "The castle is large, and you'll have servants to handle the work you've been doing yourself. You'll have time to read, to pursue whatever interests you. The gardens here are extensive. Perhaps you'd enjoy overseeing their care." For the first time since entering the room, Abigail's face lit up with something approaching enthusiasm. "I would like that very much, Your Grace." "Jonathan," he said suddenly. "When we're alone, you may call me Jonathan. We are to be married, after all." "Jonathan," she repeated softly, as if testing the name on her tongue. "It's a strong name." They talked for another hour, covering practical matters, the ceremony, her role as Duchess, the expectations of their marriage. Throughout it all, Jonathan found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her green eyes, the way she listened carefully to everything he said, the quiet dignity with which she accepted her fate. She was not what he had expected, this girl who had been sold to pay a debt. She was stronger than he had anticipated, more thoughtful, more interesting. Perhaps this arrangement would not be the burden he had feared it might be. When their conversation concluded and Abigail rose to leave, Jonathan found himself reluctant to see her go. "Miss Turner, Abigail," he said as she reached the door, "I want you to know that while this may not be a conventional marriage, I will do my best to ensure that you are comfortable and content here. You have my word on that." Abigail turned back to look at him, and for a moment he thought he saw something like hope flicker in her green eyes. "Thank you, Jonathan. That means more to me than you might realize." After she left, Jonathan remained in the library for a long time, staring into the fire and thinking about the woman who would become his wife tomorrow. She was not Catherine. No one could ever be Catherine. But perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps what he needed was not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely different. Tomorrow, he would marry Abigail Turner, and they would begin this strange new chapter of their lives together. He could not offer her love, but he could offer her respect, kindness, and security. Perhaps for both of them, that would be enough. As he finally made his way to his own chambers, Jonathan found himself thinking about the way Abigail's face had brightened when he mentioned the gardens. Such a small thing to bring her joy, and yet it had transformed her entire countenance. Perhaps there was hope for them both after all. The reluctant bride. The morning of her wedding dawned grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens were weeping for the loveless union about to take place. Abigail stood at the window of her magnificent new chambers, watching the rain streak down the diamond-paned glass, and tried to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. In a few hours, she would become the Duchess of Ravenshollow, wife to a man she had met only once. The thought was both terrifying and surreal. Yesterday, she had been nobody, a burden, a servant in all but name, a girl whose worth had been measured at exactly £500. Today, she would be one of the highest-ranking women in England. The irony was not lost on her. "Good morning, Your Grace," came a soft voice from behind her. Abigail turned to see a young maid entering with a breakfast tray, followed by Mrs. Hartwell and two other women she didn't recognize. "I'm not Your Grace yet," Abigail said gently, though the title felt strange even to contemplate. "You will be soon enough," Mrs. Hartwell replied briskly, "and it's best to become accustomed to it. Now then, we have much to accomplish before the ceremony. This is Miss Pemberton, His Grace's seamstress, and Mrs. Davies, who will be attending to your hair." The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Abigail feeling like a doll being dressed for display. The wedding gown that had been prepared for her was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Ivory silk with delicate pearl beading and Brussels lace that must have cost more than the Turners spent on food in a year. It fit her perfectly, though she couldn't imagine how that was possible since no one had taken her measurements. His Grace provided a description, Miss Pemberton explained when Abigail voiced this confusion. "He has an excellent eye for such things." The thought that Jonathan had studied her closely enough to accurately describe her measurements to a seamstress was both flattering and unsettling. What else had he noticed about her during their brief meeting? Mrs. Davies proved to be an artist with hair, transforming Abigail's simple auburn locks into an elaborate arrangement of curls and braids adorned with tiny pearls and orange blossoms. When she finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror, Abigail barely recognized the elegant woman staring back at her. "You look beautiful, miss," the young maid said softly. "His Grace will be very pleased." Would he? Abigail wondered. Or would he simply be satisfied that his new wife looked the part of a duchess? She supposed it didn't matter either way. This marriage was a business arrangement, nothing more. The ceremony was to take place in the castle's private chapel, with only a handful of witnesses present, as Mrs. Hartwell led her through the corridors toward the chapel. Abigail tried to memorize the route, though she suspected it would take her weeks to learn her way around this vast castle. The chapel was small but exquisite, with stained glass windows that cast jeweled light across the stone floor and wooden pews that had been polished to a warm glow. At the altar stood the vicar, a kindly-looking elderly man who smiled warmly when he saw her approach, and beside him stood Jonathan. Abigail's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. Yesterday, in the library, she had been too nervous to truly appreciate his appearance. Now, dressed in formal black with a pristine white cravat and his dark hair perfectly arranged, he looked every inch the aristocratic duke he was. He was handsome in a classical way, tall and broad-shouldered, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. But there was something else about him, something that had nothing to do with his physical appearance. There was a sadness in his bearing, a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders like an invisible burden. This was a man who had suffered greatly, and the knowledge of that suffering was written in every line of his face. As she walked down the short aisle toward him, their eyes met, and she saw something flicker in his dark gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. Whatever it was gone so quickly that she might have imagined it. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. Abigail spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love, honor, and obey a man she barely knew. Jonathan's voice was deeper, more resonant, but equally devoid of emotion as he made his own promises. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Jonathan leaned down to kiss her, Abigail felt a jolt of electricity at the brief contact. His lips were warm and firm against hers, and for just a moment she caught a hint of something beneath his controlled exterior, a loneliness that matched her own. "Your Grace," he said softly as they broke apart, and she realized he was addressing her with her new title. "Your Grace," she replied, offering him a small smile. The wedding breakfast was held in the castle's smaller dining room, with only Mrs. Hartwell, Stevens the butler, and a few other senior staff members in attendance. The food was magnificent, delicate pastries, fresh fruit, champagne that sparkled like liquid gold, but Abigail found she had little appetite. Everything felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold before her eyes. Jonathan was an attentive host, ensuring her glass was never empty and making polite conversation about the castle and its history. But Abigail could sense the distance he was maintaining, the careful wall he had erected between them. She was his wife now, but she was still a stranger, and he clearly intended to keep it that way. After the breakfast concluded and the staff had departed, Jonathan turned to her with the same formal politeness he had shown throughout the day. "I thought you might like to see your apartments," he said. "Mrs. Hartwell can show you around the castle properly tomorrow, but for now—" "Of course," Abigail replied, though the thought of being alone in this vast castle was daunting. The Duchess's apartments were located in the south wing of the castle, connected to the Duke's chambers by a door that Abigail noticed was currently locked. The rooms were magnificent. A sitting room decorated in shades of blue and gold, a bedroom dominated by a four-poster bed hung with silk curtains, a dressing room larger than the entire cottage where she had grown up. "These were Catherine's rooms," Jonathan said quietly, and Abigail heard the pain in his voice when he spoke his late wife's name. "I've had them redecorated, of course. I thought you should have your own space, your own sanctuary." Abigail walked slowly through the rooms, running her fingers over the beautiful furniture, the silk hangings, the delicate porcelain ornaments. Everything was perfect, elegant, expensive, and completely foreign to her. "It's beautiful," she said, because she sensed he was waiting for some response. "Thank you. Your personal maid will be Mary. She's young but well-trained. If you need anything else, anything at all, you have only to ask Mrs. Hartwell or Stevens. What about you? The question slipped out before Abigail could stop it, and she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I mean, if I have questions or need to discuss household matters. Of course, Jonathan said, though she noticed he didn't quite meet her eyes. We can arrange regular meetings to discuss such things. Perhaps once a week? Once a week. Abigail tried not to let her disappointment show. She had known this would not be a conventional marriage, but the reality of it, the loneliness of it, was more difficult than she had anticipated. I should let you rest, Jonathan continued, moving toward the door. It's been a long day for both of us. Jonathan, Abigail called softly as he reached for the door handle. He turned back to her, his expression carefully neutral. Thank you. For the dress, for the ceremony, for giving me a home. I know this wasn't what you wanted, but I'm grateful. Something shifted in his dark eyes, a flicker of emotion that was gone too quickly for her to identify. Good night, Abigail, he said quietly. Welcome to Ravenshollow Castle. After he left, Abigail stood alone in her magnificent new rooms and tried not to cry. She had gotten exactly what she had expected: security, comfort, a roof over her head. She had no right to want more, no right to feel disappointed that her husband treated her like a polite stranger. But as she prepared for bed in her beautiful new nightgown, as she slipped between silk sheets that were softer than anything she had ever imagined, Abigail couldn't help but think about that brief moment when Jonathan had kissed her, the hint of warmth and loneliness she had sensed beneath his controlled exterior. Perhaps in time, they might become friends, if nothing else. Perhaps this marriage of convenience might evolve into something resembling companionship. It wasn't love, but it was something to hope for, and after 19 years of having very little to hope for, even that small possibility felt like a gift. As sleep finally claimed her in her grand new bed, Abigail dreamed of gardens and gentle hands, of a man with sad eyes who might someday learn to smile again. It was a foolish dream, perhaps, but it was hers, and for the first time in her life, she was free to dream whatever she chose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to this strange new life. But tonight, she was the Duchess of Ravenshollow, and despite everything, that felt like a kind of miracle. The slow thaw. The first month of marriage passed in a careful dance of politeness and distance. Abigail settled into her role as Duchess with a grace that surprised even herself, managing the household staff with quiet efficiency and learning the intricate social protocols that governed her new position. Jonathan maintained his routine of polite formality, meeting with her once a week to discuss household matters and otherwise keeping to his own wing of the castle. It was a lonely existence, but not an unhappy one. For the first time in her life, Abigail had time to read without interruption, beautiful clothes to wear, and enough food to satisfy her hunger. The servants treated her with respect, and Mrs. Hartwell had become something approaching a friend, teaching her the finer points of managing a great household. But it was the gardens that truly captured Abigail's heart. Ravenshollow's gardens were vast and varied, ranging from formal parterres near the castle to wild woodland walks that stretched for miles across the estate. Much of it had been neglected in recent years. Jonathan clearly had little interest in maintaining something that had once brought him joy, but the bones of a magnificent design were still visible beneath the overgrowth. Abigail began spending her mornings in the gardens, working alongside the groundskeepers to restore order to the chaos. She found a peace there that she had never known before, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere duty. Under her gentle guidance, the gardens began to bloom again, and she took a quiet pride in each small victory. A rosebush coaxed back to health, a pathway cleared of weeds, a fountain restored to working order. It was during one of these morning garden sessions that Jonathan first discovered her there. Abigail was kneeling beside a bed of struggling lavender, carefully removing the weeds that threatened to choke the fragrant plants, when she became aware of someone watching her. Looking up, she saw her husband standing on the terrace above, his dark eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Good morning," she called, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her simple morning dress. "I hope you don't mind. I've been working with the gardeners to restore some of the beds." Jonathan descended the stone steps slowly, his gaze taking in the improvements she had made. "You've accomplished a great deal," he said, and she thought she heard genuine approval in his voice. "The gardens are beautiful," Abigail replied. "They just needed a little attention to bring them back to life." "Catherine loved these gardens," Jonathan said quietly. his voice taking on that distant quality it always had when he mentioned his late wife. She spent hours here, planning new plantings, designing new areas. After she died, I couldn't bear to maintain them. Abigail felt a pang of sympathy for his loss, but also a flicker of concern. Should I not be working here? If it's too painful. No, Jonathan said quickly, then seemed surprised by his own vehemence. No, I think she would have liked to see them cared for again. She always said gardens were meant to bring joy, not sorrow. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her, and Abigail treasured the small glimpse into his heart. Would you like to walk with me? I could show you what we've accomplished so far. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. I would like that. They walked together through the restored sections of the garden, Abigail pointing out the improvements and explaining her plans for future work. Jonathan listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed a deeper knowledge of horticulture than she had expected. You know a great deal about gardening, she observed, as they paused beside a newly planted bed of herbs. Catherine taught me, he replied. She said a man should understand the land he's responsible for, even the decorative parts. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, then added, She would have liked you, I think. You have the same gentle way with growing things. The compliment, unexpected and sincere, made Abigail's heart flutter in a way that was both pleasant and alarming. She was growing too fond of these small moments of connection, too hopeful that they might lead to something more substantial. Thank you, she said softly. That means a great deal to me. Their garden walks became a regular occurrence after that. Every few days, Jonathan would appear on the terrace as Abigail worked, and they would stroll together through the grounds, discussing the progress of the restoration and the plans for future improvements. These conversations gradually expanded beyond gardening to include books they had both read, observations about the estate and its tenants, and even occasional debates about politics and philosophy. Abigail began to look forward to these encounters with an eagerness that worried her. Jonathan was intelligent and well-educated, with a dry wit that emerged when he forgot to maintain his careful emotional distance. She found herself studying his face during their conversations, noting the way his eyes lit up when he discussed something that interested him, the rare smile that transformed his austere features into something approaching warmth. She was falling in love with her husband, and she knew it was a dangerous thing to do. The realization came to her one evening as she sat in her sitting room reading by the fire. She had been thinking about something amusing Jonathan had said that morning, smiling at the memory, when the truth hit her with startling clarity. Somewhere in the midst of their careful friendship, her feelings had deepened into something far more perilous. It was foolish, she told herself. Jonathan had made it clear that this marriage was one of convenience only, that his heart was buried with his first wife. He was kind to her, yes, and he seemed to enjoy her company, but that was a far cry from love. She would only cause herself pain by hoping for something he could never give. But knowing the danger didn't make her feelings any less real, and as the weeks passed, Abigail found it increasingly difficult to maintain her emotional equilibrium. Every smile from Jonathan, every moment of shared laughter, every accidental brush of their hands as they walked together sent her heart racing in a way that was both wonderful and agonizing. The crisis came on a rainy afternoon in late autumn. Abigail had been caught in a sudden downpour while working in the gardens and had taken shelter in the old greenhouse at the far end of the grounds. The building had been abandoned for years, its glass panels cracked and its interior overgrown with wild vines, but it provided adequate protection from the storm. She was examining the structure, wondering if it might be restored to use, when Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his dark hair damp from the rain and his expression concerned. Mrs. Hartwell said you hadn't returned from the gardens, he said, stepping inside and shaking the water from his coat. I was worried you might be caught in the storm. The simple fact that he had noticed her absence, that he had cared enough to come looking for her, made Abigail's heart swell with dangerous hope. I'm fine, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I was just waiting for the rain to ease. Jonathan looked around the dilapidated greenhouse, his expression thoughtful. I remember when this was Catherine's pride and joy. She grew exotic plants here, orchids and tropical flowers that couldn't survive outside. After she died, I had it closed up. I couldn't bear to see it empty. It could be beautiful again, Abigail said softly. With some work, some new glass, proper heating. Would you like that? Jonathan asked, turning to look at her directly. Would you like to restore it? "I would love that," Abigail replied honestly, "but only if you're certain it wouldn't be too painful for you." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm beginning to think," he said slowly, "that perhaps it's time to stop living in the past. Perhaps it's time to create new memories instead of just preserving old ones." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that went far beyond the restoration of a greenhouse. Abigail felt her pulse quicken as she realized that something fundamental was shifting in their relationship, that the careful walls Jonathan had built around his heart might finally be showing cracks. "Jonathan," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to say something. But before she could find the words, the sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of one of the groundskeepers, come to inform them that the storm was passing and the way back to the castle was clear. The moment was broken, but as they walked back through the dripping gardens together, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Jonathan had spoken of creating new memories, of moving beyond the past. Could it be possible that he was beginning to see her not just as a convenient wife, but as someone who might have a real place in his future? It was a dangerous hope, but as Abigail changed out of her wet clothes and prepared for dinner, she found herself nurturing it despite her better judgment. Perhaps, just perhaps, this marriage of convenience might become something more. Perhaps two broken souls really could heal each other, one careful step at a time. The awakening. Winter settled over Raven's Hollow Castle like a soft grey blanket, bringing with it a sense of intimacy that the vast halls had lacked during the warmer months. With the gardens dormant and outdoor work impossible, Abigail found herself spending more time indoors, and somehow, almost without either of them noticing, her interactions with Jonathan became more frequent and more personal. It began with the restoration of the greenhouse. True to his word, Jonathan had arranged for glaziers and carpenters to repair the structure, and by December it was ready for use again. Abigail threw herself into the project with enthusiasm, researching exotic plants and planning the layout with the same careful attention she had given to the outdoor gardens. Jonathan, to her surprise and delight, became an active participant in the project. He would appear in the greenhouse most afternoons, rolling up his sleeves and working alongside her to prepare beds, install heating pipes, and arrange the delicate plants that arrived weekly from London's finest nurseries. "Catherine would be amazed," he said one afternoon as they worked together to pot a collection of rare orchids. "She always complained that I had no patience for the delicate work." "Perhaps you just needed the right teacher," Abigail replied, then blushed at the implication of her words. Jonathan looked up from the orchid he was carefully transplanting, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression that made her heart skip. "Perhaps I did," he said quietly. These moments of connection were becoming more frequent, small instances where the careful politeness between them gave way to something warmer and more genuine. Abigail treasured each one, even as she tried not to read too much into them. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Abigail was in the library, curled up in one of the large leather chairs near the fire, reading a volume of poetry she had discovered on one of the higher shelves. The room was warm and quiet, lit only by the flickering flames and a few strategically placed candles. She was so absorbed in her reading that she didn't notice Jonathan's arrival until he cleared his throat softly. Looking up, she saw him standing in the doorway, still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to rise. "I didn't realize you wanted to use the library. I'll just—" "Don't go," Jonathan said quickly, stepping into the room. "Please, I couldn't sleep and I thought I might find something to read." There was something different about his manner tonight, a restlessness that she had never seen before. As he moved to the bookshelves, Abigail noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Jonathan paused in his examination of the books, his back still turned to her. "Today is the anniversary," he said quietly. 3 years ago today, Catherine and our son died." Abigail's heart clenched with sympathy. She had wondered why he had seemed so distant and melancholy all day, why he had barely spoken during dinner. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "It must be a very difficult day for you." "It is," Jonathan admitted, finally turning to face her. "Every year I think it will be easier, but somehow, grief doesn't follow a schedule," Abigail said gently. "There's no timeline for healing from such a loss." Jonathan looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such understanding from someone so young. "You speak as if you know something about loss." I lost my mother when I was 5, Abigail replied. I know it's not the same as losing a spouse and child, but I do understand how grief can ambush you when you least expect it. Jonathan moved to the chair across from hers, settling into it with a weariness that seemed to come from his very soul. Tell me about her, he said. Your mother. It was the first time he had ever asked her a personal question that wasn't related to household management, and Abigail felt a flutter of hope at this sign of genuine interest. She was beautiful, Abigail said, her voice soft with memory, not just in appearance but in spirit. She had this way of making everyone around her feel special, valued. She used to sing while she worked in her garden, and she would tell me stories about the flowers, as if each one had its own personality and history. She sounds wonderful, Jonathan said sincerely. You must miss her terribly. I do, Abigail admitted, but I've learned to treasure the memories rather than mourn the loss. She gave me so much love in those 5 years that I can still feel it sometimes, like a warm hand on my shoulder when I'm sad or afraid. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I can't feel them anymore, he said. Catherine and Thomas. For the first year after they died, I could still sense their presence, could almost hear Catherine's laughter echoing through the halls. But now there's just silence. The pain in his voice was so raw, so profound, that Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. Without thinking, she rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside his, placing her hand gently over his. Perhaps, she said softly, the silence doesn't mean they're gone. Perhaps it means they're at peace, and they want you to be at peace too. Jonathan looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. I don't know how to be at peace, he said. I don't know how to live without the weight of their loss. You don't have to live without it, Abigail replied. You just have to learn to carry it differently. Let it be a reminder of how much you loved them, not a punishment for surviving when they didn't. Jonathan's fingers tightened around hers, and when he looked up, his dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. How did you become so wise? He asked. You're barely 19, and yet you understand things that I, at 32, am still struggling with. Pain teaches wisdom, Abigail said simply, and I've had my share of pain, even if it's different from yours. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, her hand still covering his, both of them staring into the dancing flames. Abigail was acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment, of the trust Jonathan was showing her by sharing his grief so openly. Abigail, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, I need you to know, this marriage, our arrangement, it's not what I expected it to be. Abigail's heart began to race, though she wasn't sure if it was with hope or fear. What do you mean? Jonathan turned in his chair to face her fully, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with surprising tenderness. I mean that somewhere in these past months, you've become more than just a convenient wife to me. You've become important, essential even. The words sent a thrill through Abigail's entire being, but she forced herself to remain cautious. Important how? She whispered. I look forward to our conversations, Jonathan said, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, wondering what you're reading, what you're planning for the gardens, whether you're happy. When I couldn't find you during that storm, I was genuinely frightened that something might have happened to you. Jonathan, Abigail breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I know I have no right to ask for more than what we agreed upon, he continued. I know I told you not to expect love from this marriage, but I find myself hoping, that is, I wonder if perhaps— Yes? Abigail prompted gently when he seemed to struggle for words. I wonder if perhaps we might try to build something real between us, Jonathan finished in a rush. Not the marriage of convenience we started with, but something genuine, something that honors both our pasts while creating a future we can share. Abigail felt her heart soar, even as tears spilled down her cheeks. I would like that very much, she whispered, more than I can possibly express. Jonathan's smile, when it came, was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Then perhaps we might start again, he said, rising from his chair and extending his hand to her. Hello, I'm Jonathan Whittaker, and I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance. Abigail laughed through her tears, taking his offered hand and rising to stand before him. Hello, I'm Abigail Turner, Whittaker now, I suppose, and the pleasure is entirely mine. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to court you properly? Jonathan asked, his voice warm with affection and just a hint of nervous uncertainty. I know we're already married, but I'd like to win your heart the way I should have from the beginning. You already have my heart, Abigail said softly, then blushed at her own boldness. You've had it for weeks now, though I was afraid to admit it even to myself. Jonathan's response was to draw her into his arms and kiss her, not with the perfunctory politeness of their wedding day, but with a passion and tenderness that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Abigail felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. I love you, Jonathan said, resting his forehead against hers. I didn't think I could ever love again, but you've awakened something in me that I thought was dead forever. I love you too, Abigail replied, her voice trembling with emotion. I have for so long, but I was afraid to hope that you might someday feel the same. They held each other in the firelight, both marveling at the unexpected turn their lives had taken. What had begun as a transaction, a marriage of necessity, had somehow transformed into something beautiful and real. The transformation. The weeks following their declaration of love were like a second honeymoon, though infinitely sweeter than the first had been. Jonathan courted Abigail with all the attention and romance he had denied her during their early marriage, bringing her flowers from the greenhouse they had restored together, reading poetry aloud to her in the evenings, and taking long walks through the winter landscape as they talked about everything and nothing. The change in Jonathan was remarkable. The distant, grief-stricken man Abigail had married was replaced by someone warmer, more open, more alive. He laughed more readily, smiled more often, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in the simple activities they shared. You've brought him back to life, Mrs. Hartwell observed one morning as she and Abigail planned the day's meals. I haven't seen His Grace this happy since before the tragedy. You've worked a miracle, Your Grace. Abigail blushed at the praise, but she couldn't deny the truth of it. Jonathan was a different man than he had been even a month ago, and she took quiet pride in knowing that her love had played a part in his transformation. The physical aspect of their marriage evolved naturally from their emotional connection. One snowy evening in January, as they sat together in Abigail's sitting room reading by the fire, Jonathan looked up from his book to find her watching him with an expression of such tender affection that it took his breath away. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, setting aside his volume and moving to sit beside her on the sofa. "You," Abigail replied honestly. "How much I love you. How grateful I am that fate brought us together, even in such an unlikely way." Jonathan cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes serious. "Abigail, I want you to know that I don't expect, that is, I don't want you to feel obligated to. We can take our time with the physical aspects of our marriage. I want you to be comfortable, to be ready." Abigail's heart swelled with love for this man who was so careful of her feelings, so determined to ensure her happiness above his own desires. "I am ready," she said softly. "I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." That night, Jonathan made love to her with a tenderness and passion that exceeded her wildest dreams. He was gentle and patient, taking care to ensure her comfort and pleasure, and when she cried out his name in the throes of passion, he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Afterwards, as they lay entwined in her silk-hung bed, Abigail marveled at the transformation in her life. 6 months ago, she had been a servant in all but name, unloved and unwanted. Now she was a duchess, cherished by a man who had once seemed as distant as the stars. "What are you thinking about now?" Jonathan asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How much my life has changed," Abigail replied, snuggling closer to his warmth. "Sometimes I can barely believe this is real." "It's real," Jonathan assured her, his arms tightening around her. "You're real. Our love is real, and our future together is real. I promise you that." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a renewed energy to both the castle and its inhabitants. The gardens burst into bloom under Abigail's careful tending, and the greenhouse became a paradise of exotic flowers and lush greenery. Jonathan threw himself into estate business with an enthusiasm he hadn't shown in years, consulting with Abigail on various improvements and innovations. "I've been thinking," he said one morning as they walked through the rose garden, admiring the new buds that promised a spectacular display in a few weeks. "Perhaps it's time we entertained again. We could host a house party, invite some of my friends and their wives. I'd like to show you off properly." Abigail felt a flutter of nervousness at the suggestion. "Are you certain? I mean, I'm hardly the sort of duchess your friends would expect. My background, my lack of connections—" "Your background is what makes you remarkable," Jonathan said firmly, stopping to take her hands in his. "You've overcome adversity with grace and dignity. You've transformed not just these gardens, but this entire castle. You've brought joy and life back to a place that was dying of neglect and sorrow. Any friend of mine who can't see your worth isn't worthy of our hospitality." The house party was planned for late May, when the gardens would be at their peak and the weather perfect for outdoor entertainments. Abigail threw herself into the preparations with characteristic thoroughness, working with Mrs. Hartwell to plan menus, arrange accommodations, and organize activities for their guests. "You're going to be magnificent," Jonathan assured her the night before the first guests were due to arrive. "I have complete faith in you." "What if they don't like me?" Abigail asked, voicing the fear that had been plaguing her for weeks. "What if they think you've married beneath yourself?" "Then they'll be wrong," Jonathan replied simply. "And if they can't see what I see in you, that's their loss, not ours." The guests began arriving the next afternoon, a collection of Jonathan's closest friends and their wives, all curious to meet the mysterious woman who had captured the heart of the reclusive Duke of Ravenshollow. Abigail greeted each arrival with gracious warmth, her natural dignity and genuine interest in others quickly winning over even the most skeptical visitors. "She's delightful," Lady Pemberton whispered to her husband as they watched Abigail charm a group of guests with stories about the garden restoration. "Not at all what we expected." "What did you expect?" Lord Pemberton asked with amusement. "I don't know," his wife admitted. "Someone more calculating, I suppose. Someone who had obviously married Jonathan for his title and fortune, but she clearly adores him, and he's absolutely besotted with her." It was true. Jonathan rarely left Abigail's side during the house party, his pride in her evident to everyone present. He watched her with an expression of such love and admiration that even the most cynical observers were forced to acknowledge the genuine nature of their affection. The highlight of the party was a garden tour led by Abigail herself, during which she explained the restoration work and shared her plans for future improvements. Her knowledge and passion for the subject were evident, and by the end of the tour, she had won over even the most skeptical guests. "You've created something truly beautiful here," the Duchess of Marlborough told her as they stood in the restored greenhouse, surrounded by blooming orchids and exotic ferns. "Jonathan is a lucky man to have found someone who shares his love for this place." "I'm the lucky one," Abigail replied sincerely. "He gave me a chance to become more than I ever dreamed possible." As the house party drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Abigail felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had passed the test, had proven herself worthy of her position as Jonathan's Duchess. More importantly, she had seen the pride and love in her husband's eyes as he watched her interact with his friends, and she knew that their marriage had truly become everything she had dared to hope for. "You were perfect," Jonathan told her, as they stood on the castle steps, waving goodbye to the last of their guests. "Absolutely perfect. I've never been prouder of anyone in my life." "Thank you for believing in me," Abigail replied, leaning into his embrace. "For giving me the chance to prove myself." "You didn't need to prove anything," Jonathan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You just needed to be yourself. That's all you've ever needed to be." That evening, as they sat together in their favorite spot in the library, Abigail reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. She had been sold like a piece of property to pay a debt, but that transaction had led to the greatest love story of her life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Jonathan suddenly. "The way we came together, I mean. Do you ever wish we had met under different circumstances?" Jonathan considered the question seriously before answering. "I think," he said finally, "that we met exactly when and how we were meant to. If we had encountered each other in a ballroom or at a social gathering, I might have overlooked you. I was so lost in my grief that I couldn't see beyond my own pain. But the circumstances that brought you here forced me to really look at you, to see your strength and grace and beauty. In a strange way, I'm grateful for Harold Turner's gambling debt." "So am I," Abigail admitted. "As terrible as it sounds, I'm grateful for everything that led me to you, even the years of hardship and loneliness, because they taught me to value what we have together." "We've both been transformed by this love," Jonathan observed. "You've become the Duchess you were always meant to be, and I've remembered how to live again." As summer settled over Ravenshollow Castle, bringing with it long days of sunshine and the full glory of the restored gardens, Abigail often found herself marveling at the unexpected turns life could take. She had begun this journey as payment for a debt, worth exactly the price of a horse. But love had transformed her into something priceless, a woman cherished beyond measure by a man who had thought his heart was buried forever. Their love story was unconventional, perhaps even scandalous by society's standards. But it was theirs, and it was real, and it had proven that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom in the most unlikely soil. The girl who had been sold for £500 had become a duchess worth far more than gold, and the duke who had thought himself incapable of love again had discovered that the heart, like a garden, could always be restored to bloom anew. The harvest of love. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the gardens of Ravenshollow Castle as Abigail watched her 3-year-old daughter Catherine chase butterflies among the roses, while her infant son Thomas slept peacefully in her arms. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the perfectly manicured grounds, highlighting the magnificent restoration that had become Abigail's greatest pride after her family. "There you are," came Jonathan's warm voice as he approached across the lawn, still dressed in his riding clothes after a day spent visiting tenants. At 37, he was more handsome than ever, his dark hair showing distinguished touches of silver at the temples and his eyes bright with contentment. "Papa!" Catherine shrieked with delight, abandoning her butterfly hunt to run into her father's arms. Jonathan swept her up with practiced ease, spinning her around until she giggled with joy. "Have you been good for Mama today?" he asked, settling her on his hip. "Very good," Catherine declared solemnly. "I helped with the roses, and I didn't pull any flowers, and I shared my biscuits with the birds." "What a perfect little lady you are," Jonathan said, pressing a kiss to her dark curls, so like his own, before turning his attention to his wife and son. "How was your day?" Abigail asked, as he leaned down to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "Productive," Jonathan replied, settling beside her on the garden bench. "The new cottages are nearly finished, and the harvest looks to be excellent this year, but I missed you terribly." "You were only gone for a few hours," Abigail laughed, but her heart warmed at his words. Even after 5 years of marriage, Jonathan still made her feel cherished and desired. "A few hours too many," he said, reaching over to stroke baby Thomas's downy head. "How is our young lord today?" "Perfect, like his sister," Abigail replied, gazing down at her son with infinite tenderness. "He slept most of the afternoon, which gave Catherine and me time to work in the greenhouse." The greenhouse had become Catherine's favorite place, just as it had been her mother's. The little girl showed an early aptitude for gardening that delighted both her parents, and Abigail had begun teaching her the names of different plants and flowers. "I have news," Jonathan said, his tone becoming more serious. "Lord Pemberton stopped by this afternoon. It seems Harold Turner died last week." Abigail felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Her stepfather had been a weak, selfish man who had caused her great pain, but she couldn't bring herself to feel joy at his death. "What of Martha?" she asked. "Apparently, she's been left in reduced circumstances. Pemberton thought you should know in case you wished to, that is, if you wanted to offer assistance." Abigail was quiet for a moment, considering. The woman who had made her childhood miserable was now alone and struggling, just as Abigail had once been. "I think," she said finally, "that we should offer her a cottage on the estate. Nothing grand, but comfortable. She's family, after all, even if she never treated me as such." Jonathan's expression softened with love and admiration. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say. Your capacity for forgiveness never ceases to amaze me." "I learned it from you," Abigail replied, reaching over to take his free hand. "You forgave me for not being Catherine, for being a stranger thrust into your life. You taught me that love is stronger than resentment." "You didn't need forgiveness," Jonathan said firmly. "You needed love, and I'm grateful every day that I was wise enough to give it to you." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the family made their way back to the castle. Catherine chattered happily about her day, while baby Thomas began to stir, making the soft sounds that indicated he would soon want his evening feeding. "Will you read to me tonight, Papa?" Catherine asked as they reached the nursery. "Of course, little one," Jonathan replied, settling her into her small bed. "What story would you like?" "The one about the princess who lived in a castle and made beautiful gardens," Catherine said promptly. Abigail smiled, recognizing the fairy tale Jonathan had created for their daughter, a thinly veiled version of their own love story, sanitized for young ears, but retaining the essential truth that love could transform even the most unlikely circumstances. As Jonathan began the familiar tale, Abigail settled into the rocking chair with Thomas, nursing him while listening to her husband's deep voice weave the story of a lonely duke and a brave young woman who brought his castle back to life. Later, after the children were asleep and they had retired to their own chambers, Jonathan and Abigail sat together on the balcony of her sitting room, looking out over the moonlit gardens. The Duchess's apartments had long since been redecorated to reflect Abigail's own taste, but the connecting door to Jonathan's rooms stood permanently open now, a symbol of the intimacy and partnership they had built together. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Abigail asked, curled against Jonathan's side. "When you told me this would be a marriage of convenience only?" "I think about it often," Jonathan admitted, his arms tightening around her. "I was such a fool, so determined to protect myself from feeling anything that I nearly threw away the greatest gift I've ever received." "We both had to learn to trust," Abigail said. "I was so afraid of hoping for too much, of believing that someone like you could ever truly love someone like me." "Someone like you," Jonathan repeated with a soft laugh. "You mean someone intelligent, beautiful, kind, and strong enough to restore not just gardens but broken hearts?" "Yes, I can see why that would be difficult to love." Abigail smiled, but her expression grew more serious as she continued. "I've been thinking about writing to some of the ladies from London, Lady Pemberton and the Duchess of Marlborough. There are so many young women in circumstances similar to what mine were, girls who need opportunities and guidance. Perhaps we could establish some sort of program to help them find their own fairy tale endings," Jonathan suggested, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not necessarily," Abigail replied thoughtfully, "but to help them find their own worth, their own strength, to show them that they don't need a prince to rescue them. They can rescue themselves." "I love that idea," Jonathan said sincerely, "and I love you for thinking of it. We'll start planning tomorrow." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Abigail reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been sold for the price of a horse, treated as a commodity to settle a debt. But that transaction had led to the greatest treasure of her life, a love so deep and true that it had transformed them both. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Jonathan asked. "For seeing me," Abigail replied. "For looking beyond what I was supposed to be and seeing who I really was. For giving me the chance to become the woman I was meant to be." "Thank you," Jonathan countered. "For saving me from myself. For bringing light back into my life when I thought I was destined to live in darkness forever. For giving me a future worth living." The girl who had been worth exactly one horse had become a woman beyond price, and the Duke, who had thought his heart was buried forever, had discovered that love, like the gardens they tended together, could always bloom again with proper care and attention. Their love story would be told for generations, not as a cautionary tale about the cruelties of fate, but as a testament to the transformative power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the truth that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the most unlikely soil. As Abigail drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by the children they had created together and the life they had built from the ashes of their separate sorrows, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She had found her home, her purpose, and her heart's desire in the arms of a man who had learned to love again because of her. The price of a horse had purchased a love worth more than all the treasures in the world, and that love would endure for all the days of their lives and beyond. From the price of a horse to priceless love. This is the story that proves true worth comes from the heart, not the marketplace. If you believe that love can bloom in the darkest circumstances and that every soul deserves to be cherished, like this incredible journey of transformation, don't forget to subscribe for more breathtaking historical romances that celebrate the triumph of love over adversity. Share in the comments. Which moment moved you most? When Jonathan first saw Abigail's true worth, or when she helped him heal from his grief? Let's celebrate love stories that prove fairy tales can come true.